I'm Roswell Encina. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Library of Congress. And on behalf of my wonderful colleagues here at the library, welcome to another Family Day here. We started this Family Day earlier this year. And our whole goal is to make sure that we connect families to the Library of Congress. So young kids and teenagers know what the Library of Congress does. So, that's our mission, to really connect and engage with all Americans from coast to coast. You don't have to be here in Washington to enjoy the Library of Congress. You could be in Alabama, you could be in California, you could be in Texas. The Library of Congress is yours. Despite our name, we are not only for Congress. We are the nation's library. We like to tell members of Congress that we're here for them and their staff, but most importantly, we're here for their constituents back home. So our mission, as I mentioned, is to connect all Americans to the library. But the big part really is what we do is we have this huge responsibility that we collect and preserve the American story. And the American story goes way beyond of what you're familiar with. So we've dedicated ourselves to pretty much collect the stories of Americans or the public that have never been heard before. That includes Asian Americans, Black Americans, LGBTQ Americans, Jewish Americans. We're making sure that the American story is preserved here at the Library of Congress. And that's why we're here today. It is AAPI month. So as a proud Asian American, I'm honored to welcome all of you here today. And which leads to our special guest. I know he needs no introduction. You know him as Sulu from Star Trek, but he's a whole lot more than that. He's a fierce activist. He's a fierce advocate for Japanese Americans and LGBTQ Americans. But most importantly, what we love about him, he's an author. So please welcome to the Library of Congress, George Takei.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a wonderful group of people here today. On a beautiful Saturday, we appreciate everyone being here on a Saturday especially.
This is a glorious Saturday afternoon in Washington, D.C.
And you've been so generous with your time. You've been here for 2 days. You met with some students yesterday. Now you're meeting with these wonderful folks. I was telling them earlier, the Library of Congress is committed in preserving the American story. You've told your story several ways, through your memoir, through a graphic novel, even through a Broadway musical. Why was it important for you to write your story in a picture book?
Well, as you say, I've told this story many, many times, but I've always considered this an important American story, not just a Japanese American story. And it is so relevant to our times today, as we're in the midst of a presidential election year. And I was a 5-year-old child then, but the lesson from that is powerfully important to American democracy. But then I realized when I was doing Allegiance on Broadway, many Japanese Americans came backstage to share with me their feelings and their emotions and how moved they were by the play. And they told me that their parents were in camp. That's the term we use, in camp. And so I would respond to them by saying, oh, which camp were they in? It might have been the same camps that we've been in, but their faces are blank. They don't know which camp. So to help them out, I asked them, was it in the desert of Arizona? Was it in the swamps of Arkansas? The cold, windy high plains of Wyoming, Idaho? They have no idea. And I realized that it's an important American story, but it's a critically important Japanese American story that many younger Japanese Americans know very little, if anything, about.
That's a good thing to mention, because I feel like there's generations of not only Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, but the public as a whole that are either unaware or have minimized this part of World War II. Why do you think so?
I think so often throughout history, the shame of a government is taken on by the victims. And the parent generation and the grandparent generation who experienced the pain and the shame, take on that shame of the government, and they don't want to share it with their children to spare them, which is an understandable reaction, but it is not a good reaction in terms of knowing your own personal family history and Americans knowing our American history that has such vital importance for our time, especially this year.
Let's give some folks here, just in case you need a history lesson. Let's go back more than 80 years. World War II broke out. Pearl Harbor was bombed. Then one day, some soldiers knocked on your family home in Los Angeles when you were a little boy.
Well, there's a lot that happened before the soldiers came. Immediately, well, the bombing of Pearl Harbor alone was terrifying. Over 2,400 people were killed. 8 major battleships were sunk. Over 130 aircrafts were totally destroyed. It was a horrific bombing. And the terror of that bombing swept across the Pacific to the West Coast and then rolled on across North America and 2 countries, Canada and the United States, all the way to the Atlantic. And the next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and immediately, Japanese Americans that had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, were looked on with suspicion and fear and outright hatred. My parents couldn't walk down the sidewalk without passing cars shouting at them, spitting at them, accusing them of being spies, saboteurs. I mean, they were innocent. They had nothing to do with it other than looking like this. And the president got stampeded by that kind of stampede going on throughout the country. My father's business was graffitied. His car had 3 letters painted on it in red paint, J-A-P, that venomous word of hatred. And the government came down with a curfew on Japanese Americans. We had to be home by 8 and stay home until 6 a.m., which was all right with us kids because we were in bed. But if any Japanese Americans were caught outside at night, they were immediately arrested and thrown into jail with no charges or anything. And the next morning, if my father went to the bank to make a deposit or a withdrawal, he discovered that his bank account was frozen. His money was all taken away. We were penniless. The business was destroyed. He cleaned off the car, but eventually had to sell it for a giveaway price.
I believe $5. I think you mentioned that in your memoir.
Right, $5. And so we literally were destitute. We had a 2-bedroom home on Garnett Street, and we couldn't make the mortgage payment, so we didn't pay it. And the next month, we didn't pay it either. But the banks didn't complain because I guess they were in on the strategy. Mm-hmm. And then on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt got stampeded by the hysteria that was going throughout the country, and he signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, all up and down the West Coast, approximately 125,000 of us, to be summarily rounded up with no charge, no trial, no due process, to be imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps, 10 of them, in the most God-forbidden places in this country.
We were talking before before we went on stage about that train ride from California to Arkansas. Could you tell us more about that? Like, you were a little boy, so you probably thought it was more of an adventure.
Well, we don't want to skip over some of the outrages because it was outrageous before the train ride.
Exactly.
It was in early May. My father came into our bedroom that I shared with my brother a year younger. Henry was 4, I was 5, and we had a baby sister. Reiko was a baby, an infant. She was in a cradle in my parents' bedroom. My father came into our bedroom, dressed us hurriedly, and told us to play in the living room. There's nothing to do there, so we were just gazing out the front window when suddenly we saw 2 soldiers marching up our driveway. They carried rifles with shiny knives attached to it. That's it right there. And they stomped up the front porch, and our front window that we were looking out was right in front of us. And they went to the front door and banged on the door with their fist. We were terrified. My father came out, answered the door, and one of the soldiers pointed his bayonet at our father. Henry and I were standing there petrified. And the soldier said, "Get your family out of this house," as clearly and bluntly as that. My father said, "I need 10 more minutes." And he went back and came out shortly with 2 boxes about this size, tied in twine for Henry and me to carry. And then he went back and came out with 2 heavy suitcases. And he said, "Follow me." And we followed him out onto the driveway and waited for our mother. And when she finally came out, escorted by the soldier who pointed the bayonet at my father, my mother came out. She had our baby sister in one arm and a heavy duffel bag in the other, and tears were streaming down her face. That is a morning I can never forget.
It's important to mention that your father is immigrated to the U.S. and your mother was born in the U.S., so which makes it doubling mortifying, honestly, that an American citizen could be treated that way.
She was born in Sacramento, California. My grandparents immigrated to Sacramento in the 1890s, and all my uncles and aunts were born in Sacramento. My father was born in Japan, but he lost his mother when he was very tiny, and his widower father, my grandfather, decided to start life anew in America. And he sailed to San Francisco with my father and his older brother. And so my father, born in Japan, was raised and educated, went to college in San Francisco. He spoke both English and Japanese fluently. Actually, his English was better than my mother's because she was actually raised in a part of the Sacramento Delta that was called Florin at that time. But now it's been engulfed by Sacramento, and the only evidence of Florin having been there is Florin Boulevard there. And there they had segregated education. Rural California wasn't too different from the American South. A different school for Asian and Latino kids, and another school, a superior school, for the white kids.
Speaking of the American South, after the soldiers came over and banged on your family door and took everyone away, you were all boarded on a train. What happened after that?
Well,
You need help with that? I got it.
We were taken on a journey of 3 days and 2 nights. We were first taken from our home to the horse stables. This was temporary because the camps weren't built yet. To the horse stables of Santa Anita Racetrack.
Yeah. Which is, I should say, very dehumanizing.
There it is.
Where families have to stay in horse stalls.
Flies buzzing in the air and the overwhelming stink of fresh horse manure, insects skittering around on the ground. And that was to be the place where we slept. Everybody taken from that area of Los Angeles were assigned a horse stall to sleep in. They said it's only temporary, that the camps are being built right now. And my baby sister, Reiko, being carried by my mother right over there, promptly got sick. And a few days later, I got sick too. And it was only because of my mother's care and spending time with us, nursing us, that we recovered. We were there for a few months, and then they said, we're moving again. It was a very transient experience, the whole of the internment. And they didn't tell us where we were going, but I, as a kid, I was curious, and I asked my father, where are we going? My father thought for a few seconds, and he said, we're going on a long vacation in the country. And my mother said she heard that it was going to be 3 days and 2 nights, a long journey. We were excited, a vacation in the country and a train ride to boot. So it was going to be a fun experience.
And kudos to your parents that they try to make it as comfortable or adventurous as possible for you and Henry. I know she packed some snacks.
She what?
She packed some snacks for you.
Oh, yeah.
Henry.
That duffel bag that she carried was a wonderful bag on that long journey. She had all sorts of wonderful things there because, riding on a train isn't as exciting as we thought. We were going to the American Southwest, days and days of hot, sweaty, dusty, boring ride. You're walking back and forth. But whenever we got bored and Henry and I got into mischief, she would dig in there and find a animal cracker box or a Cracker Jack box or a lollipop or bubble gum, all these wonderful things that she found. And then she would pull out a storybook, a picture book for Daddy to read to us, just like that. And so she made that long journey bearable, tolerable, although we didn't just have Henry and I crawled under the seats or ran up and down the aisle, and the soldiers would make us go back to we had soldiers at both ends of each car, and they were stern, except for one. I still remember. He was always humming a song. Shoo fly, don't bother me. Shoo fly, don't bother me. And so that's the song that I remember from that journey from L.A. to what turned out to be the swamps of Arkansas. As on the third day, by early afternoon, the train started to slow down, and then we saw a barbed wire fence running alongside. They built the camp just parallel to the railroad track.
Let's talk about it. For folks who may not know what they are, could you tell them what an internment camp or incarceration camp is? And we were talking about earlier, when we see photos of these internment camps now, we see the photos of Ansel Adams, we see Japanese Americans' faces, and they're in school, they're playing baseball, but it lacks the major part of what these camps really were.
The Ansel Adams photos and Dorothea Lange photos, they're wonderful photographers. Ansel Adams' photos of Yosemite. They were government-hired photographers. They were forbidden to photograph the two most powerful symbols of our incarceration, the barbed wire fence and the Sentry Tower. You can look at all the photos of Ansel Adams or Dorothea Lange's work. There are some touching portraits. They were allowed only to take pictures of us, not of our imprisonment. But there was a Los Angeles photographer named Toyo Miyatake. He had a photo studio in downtown LA. And we were forbidden to take anything to record our life within the barbed wire fence. He smuggled in a few lenses wrapped in his underwear. And then once he got to Manzanar, he was incarcerated at Manzanar, he built a box with the lenses that he had smuggled in to make his own photograph. And he captured what I consider to be the most iconic photo coming from the internment camp experience. 3 boys looking longingly beyond the barbed wire fence, with the barbed wire fence right in front of them. He took the symbols of our imprisonment on film, which Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams, as wonderful as they are, weren't allowed to do that. Toyo Miyatake got shots of the Sentry Tower. That's where the stern soldiers, armed soldiers, glared down at us. And from there, when there was some trouble, riots, they shot. And some people were killed from the Sentry Towers. So Toyo Miyatake is the essential photographer of the internment experience.
We encourage you all to look him up. Full disclosure, the Library of Congress has the photos of Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange, so you could see the photos we were talking about there.
The Library of Congress should have Toyo Miyatake's photos.
I agree.
I can add that the Japanese American National Museum, which we founded in Los Angeles, has Toyo Miyatake's photos.
And it's to echo what George is saying, that's the importance of why libraries and museums exist. Those photos may not be at the Library of Congress, but we're happy that they are at a public museum that everybody else can learn from.
Let that be a mission for the Library of Congress.
Yeah, we should get it. Let's talk about your family's time at the camp. How did your parents cope with it? How did you and your brother cope with it, and your young sister?
Well, because my father spoke both English and Japanese, he was able to communicate with the immigrant generation. They were dominantly Japanese-speaking, and the American-born generation spoke English. So he was elected block manager. He was more or less like the congressional representatives of each block. The camp was divided into blocks, and they were the block managers were to deal with the internal block issues as well as represent the block to the camp administration, and the camp's administration's orders were relayed by my father was always making speeches at meal times in the mess hall. So he played a leadership role in camp. My mother was the leadership in our little barrack unit. That was her domain, and she did everything she could to transform this raw lumber and tar paper with only a pot-bellied stove into a home. She collected rags, washed them clean, tore them into strips, and braided them into rugs, and because we like to be comfortable without our shoes, and in our unit we were in our stocking feet.
So your mother made it a point to make it feel at least like home.
Like home. And she would gather interesting branches, or if there were flowers, she'd bring them in and make our unit nice. And we had a man who had carpentry experience as a neighbor, Mr. Yamada, and she asked him to build a table and two children's chairs for us. So she made our unit a comfortable home, as comfortable as it can be. But in Arkansas, they have these horrific storms. We're reading about them in newspapers right now, or seeing them on TV. There were horrible storms. And it was at times like that Daddy disappeared, because he was a block manager, and there were problems throughout the block, places being flooded out. And I remember one thunderstorm, we all gathered around my mother, and she was like a mother hen holding us. And when the thunder went off, our barrack literally trembled, physically trembled, and it was the most terrifying thing. And Daddy couldn't be with us. That's what made it so much more terrifying, so scary, because Daddy had to be dealing with other major flooding issues and other problems.
You wrote in the book, pretty much you and your brother, your children, so you continued playing. There's one part here that really kind of troubled me. Of course, when you were there, you had to go to school. There's a lot of emotions clearly going on in camp. But what's really kind of troubling is, as you started school, they told you kids to pledge allegiance. Could you tell us, for a little boy, what was going through your mind, and you're pledging your allegiance to a country that's put you in this situation or put this stigma on you? How did you all cope?
You're an adult describing that situation.
And
I was a kid, and I went to school, and we were told to mind the teacher, my mother said. And the teacher on the first day came in and said, "I'm going to teach you the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag." And she pointed to the flag there it is. It wasn't on a stand, it was the full flag hanging in the front of the classroom. And she said, we will begin every day with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And so every morning before we started schoolwork, we stood with our hand over our chest and recited the words, "With liberty and justice for all." But right outside my schoolhouse window, I could see the barbed wire fence and the sentry tower. An innocent child, not aware of the stinging irony of the words, "liberty and justice for all." There are the barbed wire fence, and Henry and me playing, and my mother in the background with Reiko saying, "Oh, abunai, so abunai," which means dangerous. There's a little gully, a culvert there, and water was flowing, and we found little wiggly black fishies, and they're slow, so I could catch them, and Henry would hold a glass jar, and I'd put them in there, and I'd caught about half a dozen of them. And every morning, we'd wake up and take a good hard look at them growing. They got bigger, and then one day, they had grown 2 bumps on both sides. And then the next morning, legs popped out from the bumps, and their tail fell off, and they escaped from my jar by climbing up. It was like magic that happens in Arkansas swamps.
As the war continued, and your time at the camps did, things progressed. There was a time when the government started asking folks in the camps, and maybe enlist is probably not the right word, at least to be a part and be part of the war effort and fight on behalf of the country that's imprisoning them. Do you remember that, or how did your parents react to it?
It was outrage upon outrage. Right after Pearl Harbor, many young Japanese American men, like all American men, rushed to their recruitment centers to volunteer to serve in the military. This was a patriotic act by these young boys. From my age now, they were boys. A patriotic act that was answered with a slap on the face. They were denied military service, categorized as enemy alien, which is absolutely irrational, because they weren't enemies and they weren't aliens. They're Americans of Japanese ancestry volunteering to fight in the U.S. military and imprisoned with the rest of us. But a year into imprisonment, the government realizes that there's a wartime manpower shortage. And here are all these young men and women incarcerated behind barbed wire that they now wanted, they now could use. But how to rationalize drafting young men categorized as enemy alien who are already imprisoned out of that prison camp to fight for the U.S. That irrational act of internment reached its height of irrationality. They came down with a loyalty questionnaire. A loyalty questionnaire after all that outrage right after Pearl Harbor, and then the stripping us of our savings, money, destroying our banks, bank accounts, and then putting us in imprisonment. And then after a year of imprisonment, they need us. So they come down with a loyalty questionnaire, being asked of some people who they rejected and categorized as enemy aliens. They came down with a loyalty questionnaire, but in the chaos and confusion of wartime, many incompetents got lodged in the bureaucracy of government. Not too unusual even today. The loyalty questionnaire was clearly put together by these incompetents. It was a series of about 40 questions, but there were two key questions that they needed to have yes answers. Question 27 and question 28. Question 27 asked, are you willing to serve in the United States military on combat duty wherever ordered? My parents had 3 young children. One, a toddler. My baby sister, Reiko, was starting to toddle. They were being asked to abandon their children in imprisonment and bear arms to destroy or protect the government that's holding their children as hostages. It was an outrageous question. The way any parent would honestly answer a question like that, they answered no. They weren't willing to leave their very young children and bear arms to fight for the country that's holding their children hostage. Question 28 was one sentence, but it was really egregiously outrageous. It contained 2 conflicting ideas. It asked, will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? We're Americans. The government assumed that because of these faces, we have an inborn racial loyalty to the emperor. It was outrageous on the surface. So if you answered, no, I don't have a loyalty to the emperor to forswear, that no applied to the first part of the very same sentence. Will you swear your loyalty to the United States? How do you answer that? Some people thought maybe it's safer to answer yes to the first part. Will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America? But if you answered yes, it's the same sentence. The yes applied to the second part, which meant that you were confessing to a non-existent loyalty to the emperor. It was a no-win question. You lost with a yes, and you lost with a no. The only honest answer, truly honest honest answer, was no. And my parents answered no and no. And in my autobiography, To the Stars, I wrote about being woken up in the middle of the night and hearing my parents in whispered conversation over a kerosene lamp, and my mother was sniffling, and it was alarming to me. And I remember, saying, "Mama, don't cry," and they realized that I was awake, and they came and said, "We're talking about adult things. Don't worry, go back to sleep." But that's when they were talking about how to answer the loyalty questionnaire, and they finally decided both to answer as honestly, as truthfully, and as any rational person can.
What happened next?
2 no's. With those 2 no's, they were now recategorized from enemy alien to disloyal. How do you rationalize that? To take enemy aliens and call them disloyal. There are so many people that answered no, no in the 10 camps that the government decided no-nos have to be separated from the loyals. And so they chose a camp in Northern California, right by the Oregon border, Tule Lake, as the segregation camp for disloyals. And so we were all taken from the other 9 camps, the no-nos, and put into Tule Lake. So after 3 days and 2 nights of getting to Arizona, we had to Arkansas, we had to take that same kind of journey again back to California, but the northern end of California. This camp, the segregation camp for disloyals, was the most heavily militarized camp because it turned out to become the largest of all 10 camps. Most internment camps had anywhere from 6,000 to 13,000 people. Tule Lake held 18,000 people. Almost half were children like us, parents who didn't want to leave their children and break up the family. 18,000 people. It was the largest camp, and it was the most militarized of all the camps. It had 3 layers of barbed wire fences. All the other camps had just 1 barbed wire fence. Tule Lake had, other camps had sentry towers with the armed guard glaring down at us. At Tule Lake, all the sentry towers had installed in them machine guns pointed down at us. And they had a half a dozen tanks patrolling the 3rd barbed wire fence, the outer perimeter. Tanks belong on battlefields, fighting wars, not intimidating and goading already seething people by patrolling the outer and Tule Lake turned out to be the most turbulent of the 10 camps. There were young men, particularly those that had rushed to the recruitment center after Pearl Harbor, that were really angry. They became radicalized. These radicals were created by the stupidity of the U.S. government, the kind of cruelty that they poured on these people. They said, "You're going to treat us like the enemy. well, by gum, we're going to teach you how, what kind of enemies you have to contend with. And they said they're going to stay fit, ready to rise up when the Japanese military lands on continental U.S. And so they jogged early in the morning. And I remember waking up to the distant sound of those young men jogging with what they call hachimaki, a headband with the military symbol of the rising sun, the rays on them. And they chanted as their cadence, washoi, washoi. So I would wake up to the sound, the distant sound of these guys jogging, washoi, washoi, washoi. And as they got closer to our block, they'd get louder, washoi, 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 as they jogged off.
I know we're going to start taking questions from the audience here shortly. Not to wrap up the story while you were at the camps, how did your parents react to all that, and how did you finally get out of them?
My father was again asked to be, elected to be a block manager, and that was a really difficult camp to manage, but he did it. He dealt with the radicals. The radicals wanted to increase their numbers, so they tried to get volunteers by intimidating them. And sometimes they were beaten up, and then the ones that didn't want to become a member of it, they were called the Hoshidan, which translates to volunteer squad. And when some of the Hoshidan were, or one might be walking around alone, and the others that were intimidated would beat up that one Hoshidan. And so it was a turbulent camp, and my father had to deal with it, try to keep calm. And as recently as last year, this woman who was doing some research came across some records, and it showed that my father got beaten up by the Hoshidan when he tried to stop the Hoshidan from confiscating order of vegetables, crates of vegetables that they wanted to take, and he tried to stop it, and he was apparently beaten up and hospitalized in the camp hospital that seriously, and I didn't know about it. My mother kept that from us. She said, "Daddy's away," and so he was absent for a few nights, and so I'm making discoveries about how turbulent Tule Lake was about my own father as recently as last year.
Why is it, before we take questions from the audience, I want to ask you this. Why is it very important for you to amplify these stories? As we were talking about earlier, many generations have either minimized or completely are unaware that this happened. Why is it important for you to keep on raising awareness for this? As I mentioned earlier, you have this picture book, you have a Broadway musical dedicated to it, it's in your memoir, it's also in a graphic novel.
They called us enemy, and my autobiography was published in 1994 called To the Stars, little resonance of Star Trek there.
And don't worry, we'll allow you to ask some Star Trek questions.
So your question was?
Why is it important for you to keep on amplifying these stories?
Yes. When I became a teenager, I became curious about my childhood imprisonment. I remembered all the horrors and the constant moving about and all the troubles and some of the riots. They were terrifying. But I wanted to understand that as a teenager. I had memories that I didn't understand. And so I looked for books at the school library, nothing. I went to the public library downtown, nothing. This was back in the 50s. And the only person that had information on that was my father. And my father did talk about it when asked. He didn't volunteer, I asked, and we had many after-dinner conversations. And he told me about the things that he did and the anguish that he felt. But he also told me, excuse me.
That's right. While you're drinking some water, if you have any questions for George, just line up in these two microphones.
He told me about American democracy. He often quoted from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He said those are noble words. Those are ideas that make American democracy great. But, he said, our democracy's weakness also lies in those words, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, because it's a democracy by the people. And people are fallible human beings. We make mistakes. He said he respected President Roosevelt in the 30s when America was in the depth of a horrific economic depression. People were unemployed, people were homeless, people were hungry. The spirit of America was broken. And he had to rouse up the country, galvanize them in order to bring the economy up. And he said to America, there is nothing to fear but fear itself. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, that great president became filled with fear because he realized that the West Coast was just like Pearl Harbor. It was open, unprotected, and vulnerable. And there were huge numbers of people that looked just like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor up and down the West Coast. And the country was stampeded. They were angry and hateful, and he was stampeded along with them. And he signed executive orders. So even a great president is a human being, a fallible human being, and he made a horrible mistake. But ultimately, because of the campaigning that began with from the Japanese American community, and for an apology for that unjust imprisonment and redress, Congress, something undreamed of had happened in Congress. There were 3 Japanese Americans in the halls of Congress as elected officials, and there were 2 in the U.S. Senate. Both were members of the 442nd. There were those that, at the time of the loyalty questionnaire, who bit the bullet, swallowed the ugly taste, and answered yes to those offensive questions, and we were drafted, put into a segregated all-Japanese-American unit, sent to the battlefields of Europe, and they fought with incredible courage, heroism. They sustained the highest combat casualty rate and came back the most decorated unit of the entire Second World War. Welcome back on the White House lawn by President Harry Truman, who said to them, "You fought not only the enemy, but prejudice, and you won." And that 442nd Regimental Combat Team produced 2 U.S. senators, Spark Matsunaga from Hawaii and Daniel Inoue from Hawaii. He had a loose right arm. He lost his right arm on a bloody battlefield in Italy. And Senator Inoue became a good friend of ours. He attended our wedding, and he was a major help in founding the Japanese American National Museum. And with their leadership, Congress passed, Congress created a commission to gather information on the imprisonment of citizens. They dropped the Japanese American, civilians during the Second World War. And in 1981, I testified at that hearings. And in 1984, they produced a report. In that report, they found that the imprisonment of innocent Japanese Americans was caused by 3 factors. 1, war hysteria. 2, racial prejudice. And 3, failure of political leadership. This report went to the White House, and in 1988, President Ronald Reagan officially, on behalf of the U.S. government, apologized for the imprisonment and signed the Civil Liberties Act, which authorized the payment of $20,000 as a token redress, and officially apologized for the internment. America and our democracy can restore itself, but my reaction to that was, our daddy was the one who suffered the most, who did the most to try to make the experience bearable for Japanese Americans, and he had passed in '79, 9 years before the apology, and that apology would have meant so much to him. But my mother told us, Daddy always knew this day would come.
No. So,
The story of America and its human fallibility.
I mean, that definitely deserves it. George, I can clearly keep on talking with you, but I believe our audience will stone me if I don't get some questions from them. If you guys don't mind, I would, because it is Family Day, we would like to start with the kids. So I think we have a young lady right here. We'll let you go first.
Do you know if your grandma died?
What was your question?
Do you know if your grandma died?
She's asking do you know if your grandma died? I believe that's a question. If you believe your grandma died. I do kind of want to also mention that just because of the movie Oppenheimer, there's been a lot of attention on the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. You did have family members there, which included, I believe, a grandmother?
No. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and that's where my grandparents came from, but before the war began, my grandparents in Sacramento sensed the winds of war, and they left the farm in my uncle, the oldest son's care, and they returned to Hiroshima. And we were in Tule Lake by that time. We got no information. There was no newspaper or radio. We didn't know about the atomic bombing, other than rumors that came through. However, the rumors happened, and so for my mother, the most torturous thing was the unknown fact whether she, whether my mother knew whether or could find out whether my grandparents had survived. My grandmother did survive, but I lost an aunt and a cousin who happened to be in downtown Hiroshima at the time of the bombing, and their body was found in a canal. Apparently their body was burning up. I'm sorry to be so descriptive. But my grandfather, on that particular morning, was retired by then. He loved fishing, and he had gone out on the inland sea in Japan, and he was fishing, and he saw the mushroom cloud go up in the distance, and so he quickly came back. and my grandmother the house had collapsed, but she was protected, and she survived. But an aunt and a cousin did not survive. They died in the bombing.
Thank you so much, young lady. Let's go to you.
George, this book means so much. Thank you, because it's powerful and it's by you. I'm a media producer and an educator of Indigenous and Asian American descent. As an award-winning filmmaker, the process can be slow. Somebody who's working to preserve Indigenous, brown, and Black stories in a positive light, it can be very slow and it can be very costly. For you, who's been a very effective change agent, what advice do you have for us who want to change the world and prevent acts of oppression like this? And also, if I'm allowed to, how can we empower ourselves who are change agents when so much of our life is about empowering other people, especially when we have to hide aspects of our identity like orientation or culture?
What I learned from my father in the many after-dinner conversations was, if this is a people's government, we're also part of it. We're people, and we have to engage, not just sit and, he said the easiest form of government is a dictatorship. You don't have to do anything. The man will do it to us and for us. And the hardest kind of government is a democracy where we have to take responsibility. We have to participate and make things happen. And he encouraged all his children, all three of us, to be active at school, volunteer for projects, join clubs, and if you get a chance, participate in student government. And so I was a volunteer for the Red Cross when I heard about forest fires or flooding in Northern California, and volunteered to put those care packages together. And I was elected president of the Junior Red Cross at school. And then I ran for student body president my senior year and became student body president. In high school, I was senior board president. And so I was exposed to elections at a very early age. And then in my late teens, my father took me to the Adlai Stevenson for President campaign headquarters. Some of you recognize the name Adlai Stevenson. Well, of course, this is Washington. And I discovered that participating in politics is a lot of fun as well, when you're working together and stuffing envelopes and answering phones and marching with their candidate's sign. And so I discovered another way of actively participating. And yes, we see it happening today too with the Israel-Palestinian issue. But what's important is to participate in our democratic process with information, be informed. And that's why in a presidential election year, it's important to gather as much information as you can, and then, based on that information that you have, participate. I consider teachers and librarians, and here we are in the Library of Congress, to be the pillars of our democracy, because they educate us. They give us information with which to make judgments, and we can participate in electoral politics on that basis. So, as my father told me, participate, actively participate, do volunteer work, do all that you can, and gather information and cast an informed vote, or give your physical support to the judgment that you've made.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we don't have time for one more question. So,
I'll try to make it a good
yes,
one.
please.
First, thank you for coming here and sharing your story. And I'm from Sacramento, and I know about Florin Road. That's driven by that. But what I'd like to ask is about the dedication in your book. There's so much about your book that's powerful, but what stood out to me is you talked about the Star Trek vision where people do not fear each other. They love and respect and value each other and work together. And I want to know what made you believe in that vision when you're talking about how it was so cruelly and hatefully taken, because you've spoken with such faith in that and with such strength.
America is a nation of diversity. We're made up of people from all over this world. And I think that's what makes America strong and great, but also so much more engaging, so much more interesting, makes American life so vibrant. Diversity is a key. And Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, had that same belief too. He wanted to write about the 1960s, which was a turbulent time in America. The Vietnam War, which was dividing the country, people fiercely supporting the war, and people equally passionately working for peace. We had the civil rights movement going, where African Americans, after 400 years of oppression, were campaigning peacefully for equality, and they were being assaulted by law enforcement officers with fire hoses and attack dogs. It was rich material for writers to deal with, but he couldn't do it on television because it's an advertising medium. But he was a creative man. He came up with the idea of using metaphor and placing that metaphor in the future. So he placed the story of Star Trek in the 23rd century. Takes place on a starship, round, sort of like the Earth, like Starship Earth. And this starship is made up of people from the diversity of this planet. A North American was the captain. He cast the captain with a Canadian, not an American. Europe was represented by a Scottish engineer, and he was played also by a Canadian. The captain came from Montreal. The engineer, Scotty, came from Vancouver, the opposite coast. And Jimmy Doohan became a very good friend of mine. As a matter of fact, he was a good drinking buddy, and I learned a lot about him. And he said, I'm getting famous as a Scotsman, but I'm actually Irish. But, he said, I've drunk enough of the libation of Scotland to qualify playing a Scotsman. And there's that other part of this planet, Africa, and he cast an African-American woman as the communications officer. But the actress who played her, Nichelle Nichols, was not just African-American. She had French ancestry and Native American ancestry. She was part Cherokee. So Nichelle, of all of us, was the most American one of us all. We haven't gotten to Asia yet. There's that huge, vast part of this planet called Asia. But Asia is also diverse. There are many, many cultures, languages, politics, etc., in Asia. And every Asian surname, last name, is nationally specific. And his challenge was to find a name that was Pan-Asian for the Asian character that I played. Tanaka is Japanese, Wang is Chinese, Kim is Korean, and 20th century Asia was turbulent with warfare, colonization, rebellion, and he didn't want to suggest that. He wanted to, by the 23rd century, Asia would have come to understand each other and work in concert, a peaceful chunk of earth. And he wanted to find a name that suggested the union of all Asian people. He had a map of Asia pinned on his wall, and he was staring at it. And he saw off the coast of the Philippines the Sulu Sea. And he thought, the waters of a sea touch all shores. And that's how my character came to have the name Sulu.
Thank you. So George, I could say, on behalf of generations of people who've watched you both on TV and in the movies and on stage, we want to thank you for paving the way, and of course, most importantly, giving us representation in all these mediums, especially at a time before there was an Asian person on television. So on behalf of the Library of Congress, please everyone get your copy of My Lost Freedom. It's a beautiful book, and of course, get his other books too. Thank you, George, and we hope to see you back here at the
Thank
library.
you very much.
Thank you.